On a beautiful Swiss mountainside in the summer of 1998, something happened to me that would change my life forever. Partway up the mountain, I discovered a tiny Catholic chapel. I felt compelled to enter. I did so, and from that moment on, my life would never be the same again. But before I tell you what happened, let me speak about the person I was on entering that chapel. I was passionately New Age, into goddess spirituality and Native American shamanism. I meditated in nature and led groups drumming and singing Native American chants. As a fully fledged New Ager, I completely rejected Christianity. I saw it as inhibiting all that was natural and free. I understood it as outmoded, rigid, patriarchal, something unnecessary. But how wrong I was. Yet not surprisingly, if we look at my childhood, it is easy to understand why I believed all these things. I grew up in outer London during the so-called swinging 60s of parents who were decidedly progressive and secular. I was raised atheist by atheist parents. I was not baptized. The only talk of God was one of jest. I saw Christians as backward even. Christianity was simply something of the past. We atheists had seen the light. All that mattered was matter, because of course there was no God. Yet despite all this, I did see glimpses as a child of another world, a world beyond this materialistic vision, this materialism. And there was another saving grace too. My father loved sacred music, and so often our house was filled with the heavenly compositions of Byrd, Tallis, Vittoria, Palestrina, Marshall, Dufay, and many more. So you see, in some small way, the glory of Christendom had already entered my life, and for reasons I will speak about at another time, it seems that divine providence was at work here. But in our small outer London street, life was far from rosy. In those swinging 60s, people were having affairs all over the place. Our family was a casualty of that permissive culture. And tragically, my parents divorced. So my sister and I grew up with my dad, who loved us to bits. He was generous and kind to everybody. But later he remarried twice. You can imagine how unsettling that was. In short, everything I'm invoking here, atheism, permissiveness, divorce, remarriage, all these things contributed to my becoming a disturbed adolescent. And my point here is not about individuals, it's about culture. The progressive culture that normalizes so much that really shouldn't or isn't normal. And obviously, just like my parents and countless others, I participated in that progressive, permissive culture for much of my life. And in that same permissive spirit, I know that I too have done things that have caused great suffering. Now, there are huge issues here, complex ones, about marriage and the family, and I may go into them at another time, but for the moment, I'm just stressing that this progressive culture tends to normalize, trivialize even, things such as divorce and remarriage, things that contributed, as I say, to my becoming a disturbed adolescent. And it wasn't long before I fell into darkness, or sex drugs, and rock and roll, if you like. You can get some idea of the world I inhabited if I tell you that my best friend and I hung out with Nick Cave's original band, The Birthday Party, and my friends gravitated to things like Socialist Worker and the radical feminist journal Spare Rib. However, it was many years before I would be liberated from my materialistic vision. In fact, it wasn't until my late 20s when I became seriously ill. And in that illness, certain of those childhood memories resurfaced of another world, a world beyond this material one. And I began to truly see there was another world, a spiritual world. And thus my quest began. But of course I did not go towards Christianity. No, there was no way that I would go near the church. Instead, my quest took me to the New Age, which was just as progressive and secular as my atheist background, and it also fueled and supported my anti-Christian beliefs. After that, I moved close to the ancient university town of Cambridge, England. It was not long before I discovered a New Age centre there, run alongside others by the man who would later become my husband, Roger Buck. Now, Roger had lived at the Findhorn Foundation in Scotland, perhaps the leading New Age centre in the world, and there he had gained and gleaned so much about the New Age. He seemed to know everything about it, as he still does. He knew far more than me. He was so impressive. Roger and I connected, and soon I was running the New Age Centre with him. So, liberated from my atheism, I now wholeheartedly believed in a spiritual reality, but one that utterly and completely rejected Christianity. At that New Age centre in Cambridge, we ran many events, drawing hundreds of people, including workshops, groups, full moon meditations, new moon chantings, promoting the New Age vision in whatever way we could. But as I said before, personally, I turned towards goddess spirituality and Native American shamanism. I was a dedicated pagan. And all this strengthened my negative attitude towards Christianity as something patriarchal and oppressive towards women, sexuality, and the earth. And you can imagine then my utter shock, my surprise, when something completely unexpected happened to Roger, who was now my boyfriend. He had an experience out of the blue that opened his eyes towards Christianity. After 20 years in the New Age movement, he changed almost overnight. He tells his own conversion story in episode 10 of his videos. Anyway, like myself, Roger was not baptized either, and soon he was baptized in an Anglican church in Cambridge. And I was shocked, perturbed, bewildered. I felt like I was losing Roger. I really couldn't understand it. I had no idea what was going on. And whilst Roger was Anglican, he was mysteriously drawn to Catholicism, and he began to drag me to both Anglican and Catholic churches. And there was something very striking. I felt such a difference between the two churches, Anglican and Catholic. In the Anglican churches, I felt this cold, dark, cavernous, empty feeling, and it made me feel really uncomfortable. But in the Catholic churches, I felt comfort, as though there was a warmth in there that in some way held me and made me feel this comfort. And what is also striking is that at the time, I had no idea that in every Catholic church there is the Lord in the tabernacle in his Eucharist, or rather, the real presence of Christ is there. Anyway, in 1998, we went to Switzerland for much of the summer to be with family there, spending a lot of time in the beautiful Swiss Alps. And Roger took me to the great Abbey of Einsiedeln, where for the very first time in my life I went to a Catholic Mass. Now perhaps my heart was being softened towards Catholicism just a little, yet I wholeheartedly continued with my pagan life, feeling troubled by what had happened to Roger, his conversion. And in that pagan spirit, I went camping in nature to the beautiful Swiss town of Brunnen on the edge of the Lake Luzerne. Questing for ancient wisdom, I climbed a mountain, and part-way up I discovered a tiny Catholic chapel. I felt strangely compelled to enter that chapel. I did so. I sat down on the floor, began my pagan meditation, but I found myself weeping. There was something extraordinary in that place, and tears began to stream from my eyes. I wept and I wept and I wept. I wept because of the beauty in that place. I wept because I felt so dirty, sullied from my past life, sex, drugs, rock and roll and all that. I wept because I felt unworthy to be in there. I wept because however dirty and unworthy I felt welcome. I wept for the relief of that. I wept because I felt I had come home. Yet that was not all that happened to me in that chapel. There was something more, something else that was to come. Something mysterious to me still today, 20 years later. And to convey that mysteriousness, I wonder if you could imagine what it was like for me in that chapel. As I said, I went in, I sat down on the floor and began my pagan meditation when the tears began to stream, and I wept there for about half an hour. Then, when my tears subsided, I noticed something, a picture. This picture was strangely compelling to me, just as it had been compelling to enter the chapel. And I moved closer to it as though something was guiding and moving me that way. I even knelt before the picture. I had never knelt in my life before. So, what was this picture? It was this image of Jesus exposing his heart. Now I need to stress something here. I had no idea what this picture was. I had never heard about the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I knew nothing about it, nothing at all. But something happened with that picture, something I feel unable to speak about here. I will simply say that there was a moment while I was looking at that picture, a moment that changed everything. In that moment, my gaze became fixed upon Jesus' heart and only his heart. And in that moment, it felt that this heart was my true dwelling place. This heart was my home. Obviously, this was all very strange for me, but I wonder if divine providence was at work in that pivotal, that intimate moment. because later my entire spiritual life would become oriented towards the JESU SACRATISSIMUM, the most sacred heart of Jesus. But this didn't happen overnight, because as I will soon explain, my entire life had been oriented to a progressive ideology, whether it be progressive secular atheism or progressive New Ageism. I was therefore steeped in ideology that rejected Christ and his church. But right now, I want to point to the fact that my incredible 1998 experience with the Sacred Heart of Jesus in that Swiss mountainside chapel seems to foreshadow, providentially foreshadow, perhaps, what happened to me later. To illustrate this, I will briefly jump ahead in time to 2006, when Roger and I first visited Paray-le-Monial, a small town in eastern France. In Paray-le-Monial, there's an extraordinary church called the Chapel of the Apparitions, because in that chapel in 1673, our Lord appeared to Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque, revealing his Sacred Heart. The relics of Saint Margaret Mary are also in that chapel, and when I first prayed beside her relics, I also felt I had come home. I never wanted to leave. There is something in that chapel, in that town, that is astonishing. It is as though the Sacred Heart of Jesus is still beating there, and I'm far from alone in saying this. Paray-le-Monial completely changed my life. It changed Roger's life too, as he explains in episode 4 of his videos. But I'll speak about Paray-le-Monial another time. Right now, I need to get back to 1998 and what happened after my experience in that chapel on the Swiss mountainside. Roger and I returned home to Cambridge, and it may be surprising given all that happened to me in that chapel, but no, I did not become a Catholic overnight. I had been shaped my whole life by these anti-Christian progressive ideas. New Age ideas die hard. Roger was the same. Although he was now a Christian, he saw himself, spoke about himself as a New Age Christian. Perhaps that's difficult to understand, but New Agers like Roger and myself used to be. It's like there's this wall of misunderstanding towards Christianity, particularly Catholicism, a wall that has to be deconstructed brick by brick. In fact, Roger plans to talk about this wall of misunderstanding in an upcoming episode, and I want to say something here about Roger's book called JESU SACRATISSIMUM, written carefully and thoughtfully over many years, and it is not only dedicated to the most sacred heart of Jesus, but Roger's knowledge of the New Age inside out has allowed him to write a book that deconstructs New Age ideology brick by brick. I don't think there's any book out there quite like it, written by a Catholic convert who knows so thoroughly New Age thinking and secular thinking and how to deconstruct them. And it's also autobiographical, so Roger tells his own story and he also shares some of mine. Now, of course, Roger is also doing this work of deconstructing these things in his videos, and this one, episode 5, may be particularly helpful in getting a basic sense of the New Age. Anyway, to come back to my story, it was going to take more, much more, to move me out of the New Age towards Christ and his church. But that something more did happen. Something that gave me a glimpse, even a tiny glimpse, into something of the understanding of Christ's resurrection. And whilst my heart was truly with Catholicism, like Roger, I too was baptized in the Anglican Church by the same Anglican vicar, who then later married us. And after that we moved near to Schaffhausen, Switzerland, to be close to family. There we were to meet a traditional Catholic priest who presided over the beautiful Baroque church on the island of Rheinau. And in that church on Easter night of 2000 AD, Roger and I were confirmed into the Catholic Church. In utter joy, we were brought into full communion with Rome. I came home. My heart came home to his heart.